Welcome to this session. I can't imagine why this is so crowded. I know some of you are finding it difficult to, get your lunch and come back in time with sessions, and I'm sorry that if there's a bit of overrun on sessions. I do apologise for that. There's a lot to be said and, not enough time, perhaps. Just a couple of things, in case you're not aware of them, which is that we have a show at 4 o'clock and at 7:30 called Your Brother Remember, which is not part of your day pass, but a wonderful show if you want to go and see that. It's a show that explores two brothers and their lives and how one ends up in prison and the other one doesn't, and why the same life experience would send you in different directions. And then tomorrow night there are still some tickets left, not many, for Akala, Billy Bragg, Phil Jupitus and Tom Robinson doing Being a Man live. This particular session now on sex and promiscuity, fidelity, etc. Well, we're really grateful that Martin Daubney agreed to chair this, because it's not an easy panel to even contemplate, never mind chair. And some people that we approached to do it did say, I have a lot to say, but I'm not going to say it. And the thing is, I've just been talking to a few people who, how can I put this? How do we make sure that we can have completely safe, open, honest, this is real conversations without worrying about whether we're being politically correct? So, I want to just suggest that we have to accept that whatever anybody feels is what they feel, whether they're right to feel it, whatever anybody's done is what they've done, whether they're right to do it. So in some respects, what I'm trying to say is that the generosity of a festival like this, a weekend like this, has got to be that people can be heard for what they feel and not to be told that they're not allowed to feel it. And some ways around sex, this thing gets particularly explosive. The other thing is, of course, that this is a festival to respect and celebrate maleness and all the things that men can be and are, which doesn't mean that doesn't include stuff that's really difficult. But the premise is that we're here to love each other. Now, that sounds a bit gooey maybe, but I'm just going to say it, that actually it's a festival to celebrate the fact that we love men, and men are lovable. So I wanted to really make that clear, because we're about to hear something. Okay. So here's some men and a woman to talk about sex. Thank you, Martin.
Hello, guys. Sex sells, hey? Okay, so I'd like to quickly start by introducing my esteemed panel. Christopher Green, entertainer. Yeah? You all know Mat Fraser, the multi-talented disability performer and artist. And somebody with some actual factual information. Wendy Macdowall, lecturer at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and one of the leaders of the National Survey of Sexual Attitudes and Lifestyles. I'm chairing today's event. My name's Martin Daubney. I used to edit the magazine Loaded, which probably makes me a wanker in most of your eyes, but let's just get it out of the way with now. I'd like to go around and let everybody just sort of say who they are, so you know who we all are before we go into discussion, and maybe I'll go first. So yeah, I edited Loaded magazine for 8 years. Promiscuity and fidelity, I guess, were big stable topics for us because young men during the lad generation were encouraged, right, to it was masculine, it was validating to have as many sexual partners as possible. I was lambasted as a kind of champion of that lifestyle. And sort of widely vilified, I guess, for it in certain quarters. I left the magazine in 2010, at which point, when I became a father, and I found that fatherhood and lad and dad was totally incompatible, I became somewhat hyper aware and a bit embarrassed about my former existence. If, when you're asked at a childcare group, would loaded readers find breastfeeding a turn on, something, a small but important part of you dies. Reality crashed in. I then made a documentary on Channel 4 called Porn on the Brain. We set out to look at the ingress of hardcore pornography into the lives of young men and to explore the concept that could porn be addictive. And we did the world's first MRI brain study scan, and we did indeed show, amongst 19 very heavy porn users, that their brains did respond to porn in the same way that heroin or alcoholic users would respond to their stimulus. So the first thesis that porn can be addictive, we met young men whose lives had been decimated by porn usage. They were losing their jobs, they were getting criminal records for masturbating in public. They found it very hard to get erections or certainly to get any sense of enjoyment from real sex. And we found that their entire expectations of sex had been completely reprogrammed by this mass ingress of online pornography and their expectations of sex in the real world and the fears that that brought for young women. So that's me. Christopher.
I'm a performer and theatre maker, and it's nice for me to be part of being a man, because often when I'm on stage I am being a woman, with characters like Tina C and Ida Barr, amongst others. But I've increasingly been making experiential theatre, and I think probably the reason I'm here today is because I was on attachment to the National Theatre Studio, and I was working on an immersive piece of theatre about pornography, which, you know, often raises a slight titillated response. In what way can you have an experiential theatre piece about porn? But like Martin's documentary, it's looking at the end users of pornography, and is set in a self-help group for sex addicts and pornography addicts, and you go in as a punter and sit in a self-help environment, and you don't know who the performers are, you don't know who the contributors are, if this person speaking is because it's their own real experience or whether they're an actor. And yeah, it's scripted, tightly scripted, but it relies on interaction from the punters. So yeah, I've been spending a lot of time researching pornography and pornography use in the last 6 months, and it's, yeah, you can get quite obsessed with it from an academic perspective. Well, you can, because you start researching.
Honestly,
and you really, yeah, you can, and you go down routes. You know, I've looked at porn a lot in my own personal private life, and then you go down routes that you wouldn't look. You see things that you wouldn't ordinarily look at, and very, very quickly. But then also hearing a lot of testimonies from people who are addicted and the knock-on effects on their life, and I think that's something that's not been discussed too much. And it was really exciting to see your documentary. It really sort of chimed with what I was trying to do theatrically. I suppose for me, one of the things I'm interested in this whole debate, and the reason why it's an experiential piece, so it's not like let's go and sit in an audience and watch some people who've got a problem. It's because I think we've all got a problem, because our society's got a problem. We're all addicted to porn. However much we use it, our society's addicted to porn, so therefore we have to have a relationship with it, because this is the new sexual landscape, and it's different than it was 3 years ago. It's different than it was 5 years ago. So that's why it's experiential. We're all equal. There's no other in this piece, quite literally. And I suppose it can be quite tempting to look at what does it mean to be a man. Okay, what's the difference between men and women in terms of fidelity, promiscuity, pornography? What are the differences between gay men and straight men? What are the differences between young men and older men? You know, we can look at all of these facts, and it's really interesting to do that. But ultimately, we're all in the same situation. And I think if my response in this piece is about anything, it's about let's all take responsibility. Let's all work out how to talk about sex now.
Great, thank you. Matt.
Thanks, Martin. Well, I'm an entertainer, similar to Chris, and a writer. And obviously I'm disabled, as those of you who've got visual use can see. And my interest lies in the juxtaposition of disability and ... I'm delighted to be invited here, because I think you know, given that sexuality is so much a part of the identity of what a man is meant to be in modern society, when you juxtapose that with disability, it becomes incredibly complicated, and it's something I'm very interested in. I use sexuality a lot in my work because it's a shock tactic, because one of the things that disabled people are not meant to be, or not perceived as being, is sexual, both as an object for the others to consider them like a sexual being, or, you know, to be innately sexual, and yet we are sexual. You know, we fuck and we wank and we reproduce just like everybody else. And you know, I use the sexuality in my work to provoke. I think the job of an artist is to be an agent provocateur if you're interested in social change, which I am. It's not my job to tell you all how to think. It's my job to ruffle your feathers of what you're already thinking, to try and re-critique what you're thinking, to maybe upgrade it. You know, Stuart Hall, not the laughing paedophile from It's a Knockout, but the cultural commentator, says that every new piece of cultural information shifts our understanding of what culture is, and though we can't say, I think this about this, because the next time we have an input of something, it imperceptibly, albeit, changes. You try putting the words crippled sex into Google. Crippled sex movies. Go on, all of you do it when you get home, okay? You'll be, I think, quite surprised at what comes up. I certainly was, in the interests of research, as Chris was saying. No, I'm like, you know, surfing the net, using pornography to masturbate, and it suddenly occurs to me, where the fuck are all the disabled people here? Where are they? And they're not in the good parts of pornography. There aren't a lot of good parts left in pornography, I don't think. And it's rather like weed, isn't it? You know, skunk is not what we used to smoke when I'm 52. And when I was at school, the weed I was smoking was very different. Well, the porn people are wanking to is very different now. And it's similar in that respect. And about a month ago, I decided that I would stop using visual stimuli for masturbation because I was suspecting it was not good for me. And I re-engaged that old thing called imagination. And I had the most glorious wank. It was, no, but for real, right? The orgasm was more profound. The experience was more profound. It lasted longer, and it was more intense, and I felt more satisfied afterwards.
But it's a lot more bother, though, isn't it?
It's more bother, but it was more fun and much more worth it.
Yeah.
And I got to control everything. And so all I'm going to, you know, I am here to represent disability in a way. It is my interest area. And how it juxtaposes with disability in society is something I'm continually interested in. And probably, in my explorations in the past in my work, I've overstepped the mark sometimes and got it wrong. Because I'm an experimenter and a risk taker. And of course that means I'm going to get it wrong sometimes. I hold my hand up to that. And, you know, I think that we should all have this discussion and be honest about it. Right. That's why I've used words like fuck and said that I wank straight up front. I'm not showing off. I'm just trying to go, you know, we do all do this, and isn't this what we're all here to talk about? So let's not pussyfoot around. That's all.
Great stuff, thank you. Yeah. And now Wendy's got a very important presentation for us. Yeah. With some real facts and that.
Right, thank you. So I'm an academic, and us academics, we like slides. So I have some PowerPoint slides for you. So I want to talk about some findings from the National Survey of Sexual Attitudes and Lifestyles, which I hope will inform this discussion. We interviewed over 15,000 people aged 16 to 74 across Britain in their homes. And the people surveyed come from all walks of life and are representative of the British population. It's the third national survey in a series that's been conducted every 10 years since the 1990s. And taken together, they form one of the largest studies of its kind in the world. The first survey was famously handbagged by Thatcher, but the Wellcome Trust stepped in to fund it. In the second, a decade later, we recorded increases in a number of sexual behaviours that were reported variously in the media as evidence of greater liberalisation on one hand and the cause for moral panic on the other. In the most recent survey, the reporting was largely measured, though the headline the Star went for was interesting, choosing to highlight that British women remain sexually active into later life, though why this should be a surprise is somewhat perplexing. In fact, older men in the survey were much more likely to report sex in their later years than women, but that conforms with the stereotypes that we have about male sexuality and the ones that we challenge the ones that we do, both about women and about age. But sex is rife with myths and misconceptions and stereotypes, and arguably one of the most important functions of Natsal is in debunking, correcting, and challenging some of these. So let's look at some data. First of all, first intercourse. And we can see, this is the data from the most recent survey, and shows at the top with the oldest participants at the bottom and the youngest participants at the top. And we can see an increasing proportion of young people reporting first sex before 16, with decreasing age at interview, with around 30% of men and women in the youngest group reporting the event before the age of 16. And while there has been this increase, the proportion is not as high as reporting first sex before 16 that people perceive it to be. And the age at first intercourse, which is 16, for both men and women, has not changed between Natsal 1 and 2. Looking across the three surveys, we can see increases in the number of partners people reported between the first and second. But over the last 10 years, we've only seen further increases amongst women. Men still report higher numbers of partners, but the gender gap is narrowing.
Are they lying or telling the truth?
A question that's often asked of us is whether people tell the truth. And we go to great lengths to, both in terms of our methodology, we use laptops and people enter the data themselves. There's also a number of internal consistency checks. The interview takes about an hour, and actually, if you're lying all the way through, you need to be working really hard at that, because it would prompt a number of checks. But our experience is that actually, once people are taking part in the survey, they find it a positive and helpful, positive experience. And we're very, we stress firmly that this is, medical research that informs all aspects of service provision in the UK. So the numbers of partners that people record needs to be considered in the context of major changes in the timing of life events in the 6 decades represented in the most recent sample. And we can see this really dramatic widening of the intervals between first intercourse, first live-in relationship, and birth of first child, lengthening the time in which to accumulate partners, but also the time in which to avoid unintended pregnancies and sexually transmitted infections. And you can see from the graph that this widening is more marked for men than for women, and it represents a really major demographic change. So what about sexual practices, and how have they changed? In terms of heterosexual practices, we've actually seen a decrease in the reporting of recent vaginal sex. The mean number of occasions is now 3 times a month, compared with 4 times in 2000 and 5 times in 1990. We've also seen a decrease in genital contact without intercourse. There's been no change in reporting of oral sex, but we have observed an increase in reporting of anal sex amongst men and women. Turning to same-sex experience, we can see little change in reporting either same-sex experience involving genital contact or any same-sex experience, though it's actually a very different picture for women, with a 4-fold increase in reporting of both these behaviours between the first and third survey. In terms of attitudes, Britain's become increasingly tolerant of same-sex relationships, both between men and between women and women. But interestingly, our attitudes have hardened towards one-night stands, and we've also seen a hardening of attitudes to non-exclusivity in marriage. I did say I wouldn't talk about fidelity. We talk about non-exclusivity.
If you keep saying hardening as well.
Yeah.
Anybody else spot that?
So I thought the last slide I'd show would be around satisfaction with our sex lives. And this is the picture for men. This slide shows satisfaction with your sex life by the relationship status. And a higher proportion of men are likely to report being satisfied with their sex lives if they're living with a partner or in a steady relationship but not cohabiting. But they are also the ones who are most likely to report recent sexual activity. And we see an extremely similar pattern in women, so perhaps we're not so different. So some conclusions. We've seen a narrowing of the gender gap, and I think this may present challenges and something that we can discuss. Challenges to masculine stereotypes. We've seen greater tolerance of diversity, but a hardening, there we go again, of attitudes towards what could be classified as disrespectful relationships. But we've also seen some contradictions. People report more partners, but less sex. And we live in an increasingly sexualized culture, but we still find it difficult to talk about sex.
Thank you. Thank you.
I don't know what you guys took away from that, but I took away some good things and some not so good things. We were just nodding there that, does it seem that men, in serious relationships are happier?
Yeah.
And should we be shocked at that? Because one thing we're always told, and one of the things that I particularly found in my time working with young men, certainly during the making of the documentary, was that they felt that the route to happiness was by being more promiscuous. Young men very much now, gauge their success, I guess, as a sexual creature by the notches on the bedpost. And when you sort of talk to them about, it's really quite horrific when you sort of talk to them about how they go on holiday and they just have the sort of fridge door system, and it really is seen as 5 points for a blowjob, 10 points for anal. And this is the sexual menu, by the way, which is, I think we could also see there as very much being programmed by visual stimulus. Why are people having double the amount of anal sex now they were a few years ago? Well, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to work out. It's because they're seeing it in porn and they want it in real life. And we're also seeing that those guys who are having more casual sex don't seem to be particularly happy. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think there's, for a long time, we've had the sense that it's hard to talk about a successful merging of your sexuality. So you meet a partner and you bring your sexuality and it meets their sexuality. And obviously there's crossover in the middle, and that should be rich and exciting and whatever. But then it's often like, yeah, but we don't talk about the rest of that. And I think if you bring that together, and that's where the richness comes. That's where you really get to know someone. And maybe that's what people are reflecting in this survey.
But why is it that we think that still it's kind of seen as like a badge of honour to be a male slag? But if you talk about the number of sexual partners of women, maybe they're lying down and the men are lying up. This bravado around the number of sexual partners.
There's one of the questions we're often asked is about why there is this difference in reporting of number of partners between men and women. And there is some evidence that men may be rounding up. There's also a difference in age.
As in logic.
There's also a difference in age mixing. So men tend to have younger partners. So that might explain some of the difference. And you'd also only expect people to have the same number of partners if you were in a closed population, because you have to be having sex with somebody, and this obviously is not a closed population.
I remember when we were making the show and I went to a porn rehab weekend. This was young guys who were practically suicidal because porn had just completely firestormed their lives. They were unable to do anything. They were masturbating all the time they were awake, basically. And it was just incredible. It was heartbreaking to spend time with these young men who were 19. I was old enough to be their father, and in many ways I kind of became like that. Spent a lot of time with them. And I'll never forget, we talked about, the book, The Game, which all young men sort of seem to read now. And it's a book which is specifically designed, and it's a bestseller It's sold millions of copies globally. It's been translated into God knows how many languages. And it's a book designed to get young men as many sexual partners as possible by basically playing the psychological games, which enables you to get laid. It's cynical, but it's absolutely prevalent. These young men were reading this and putting it into practice, and they had this complete dissociation from their own sexual activity versus that of their partners. So they were saying, well, I just want to shag. I need anal sex with her because she's got a nice bottom. Women were being distilled down to body parts which they'd been programmed to desire through pornography. And literally takes its nth extreme. She's got a nice arse, I want anal. She's got nice tits, I want to ejaculate over them. And it really was quite callously robotic. And it was almost devoid of, feeling. And you were talking about, learning how to masturbate again. These young men were told that they weren't allowed to look at porn anymore. And it looked as if somebody had sawn one of their legs off. And they were just, what do you mean? And they were being told that they weren't allowed to use porn. They should masturbate with using their minds. And they actually admitted that they couldn't. They were so overwhelmed by what they'd seen. But they talked about the girls that had porn sex with them, they would never, ever want to actually go out with, which struck me as heartbreaking. So are we seeing...
But it strikes me that that's the same as, the Victorian notion of, you sleep with a floozy or an actress or a prostitute and then you marry a nice girl. It has nothing really changed.
But it still seems to be prevalent.
It does, and it's also, for me, it's like the sexual wing of culture. It's like the last phrase there, sexualized culture, but difficulty talking about sex. No, I would argue it's a codified culture that tells you what your sexuality has to be that results in the difficulty about talking about sex. Because, all these things about being a man that we're not meant to do, I was just telling the guys the other day, I'm a big advocate of, it takes a real man to cry. And I fell over the other day, I really hurt my nose and I was bleeding and I had to go and get first aid from the plumbers next door, and they're quite blokey and laddish. And I was really upset and traumatized. I needed some rescue remedy and a hug, right? And, and I wanted to cry. I wanted to blub because I felt rotten. And in front of anyone here, I would have been able to do that. But because they were blokey plumbers, I felt that I couldn't. And I mean, in the midst of my trauma about did I have a broken nose or not, I was worried about whether I was crying in front of a load of plumbers. And this is... And I don't think I would have worried so much 15 or 20 years ago. I really don't. I think that we had a little window. We had a little window of more permissive, more egalitarian society. And I think it's become more codified and retreated back into its conservatism, of which sexual morals, and all of that stuff is a part. And, you add technology and the availability of this new pornography that's online and everything, and it becomes a whole new thing. But, in the being a man and what it takes to be a real man, and it must be very tough to be 15 and growing up in a school with all these rules that are meant to be. I self-identify as predominantly heterosexual, but I love a bit of anal play. I love to be rimmed. It's nice. It feels nice. There's nothing wrong with that. And I know now that, that's part of anal, so it's okay. But, for years, you were not allowed to be heterosexual and like bum play. The two things were not allowed to be together. And I just think the whole of society has become so codified that we're allowing our sexuality to be subservient to that conservative.
Well, isn't it? It's just capitalism, isn't it? So that all of everything we are, so our hunger and our sexuality, everything that can be exploited is exploited. And so men, biologically, is the thing. It's true, isn't it? So we're being exploited in that way, and it takes a real man and a real woman, a real person, to stand up and say, no, I'll decide what I want. I don't want my basic humanity to be exploited so that somebody somewhere is making some money.
I think one of the things that came out of the show was this feeling that young men are being intrinsically manipulated, by the provision of porn. And when we met the people who made porn, who did the programming, the technology behind porn, the algorithms, you talk to them, they say, yeah, if you click on this, then our computer knows to give you this, because that's that little bit more addictive, a little bit more appealing. The software programmers, the geeks are ruling the world in terms of the porn world. They are programming addiction in. And quite often young men are being completely overwhelmed by where they're finding themselves within sort of 2 or 3 clicks. Lots of young men don't go into websites to see, granny sex, or to see enforced, kind of mocked stage paedophilic sex, but they find themselves watching it quite often by accident. There's this feeling that young men are all porn monsters, but lots of them are actually quite overwhelmed by what they're seeing. And one of the things we found during the Making the Show as well was serious, sex addiction therapists whose job it is to kind of deal with the aftermath of this point to the fact that the orgasm in itself is the most rewarding thing that can possibly happen to a human. It's vital to the propagation of the species. And the porn industry, in many ways, is the perfect sort of mechanism to trigger this.
It's dopamine, isn't it? So
it's
food
dopamine, it's brain
and
chemicals.
sex release the chemical that we want. And we're animals. We respond to that.
But is there an argument? We talk about are men pre-programmed to be promiscuous?
I don't know. It's that caveman thing, isn't it? They say, it goes back to the caveman.
Does anybody buy that theory, or is it just like a cop-out?
I think it depends if you're talking to an evolutionary biologist, or if you're talking to a social scientist. And I would say that this is learned behaviour. This is socially we're playing out behaviours with that have a social script that go with them. And we've seen but they can change. And I believe that there is a window of opportunity now. I think we're really looking at pornography. We're really looking at consent. I think that there's a real issue around what consent means. And all of these are rooted in gender norms and stereotypes that are shaped and formed, in our teenage years. But we as a society perpetuate them, but we can challenge and change them.
I think that's the thing about when you start looking into pornography in this case, but is how plastic our brains are. So technology is changing, opportunities are changing really quickly, and our behaviour is changing, and our brains are changing. Young men's brains are changing, young women's brains are changing quickly. But that doesn't mean to say they have to change necessarily for the worse. Let's not be pessimistic about it. No. Things change and our behaviours respond. So like, for example, sexual encounters involving Grindr or, any of these kind of online dating things, they have this bizarre kind of vocabulary and way that they work that no one had ever heard of sort of 8 years ago. And now people very naturally relate to each other in this strange way, strange, good for some people, not good for other people. But our behaviours change really quickly. And I think it's about if we talk to everybody, we talk to our nieces and nephews, our children, we talk to everybody and say, isn't this how we want the sexual landscape to be? What do you want your sexual landscape to look like? Instead of just going, I can't talk about that because that's really embarrassing.
And I think the trouble with the representations often in the media is that they do focus on the sensational and what you do, and that does create these kind of unrealistic expectations. And hopefully through a sort of very dry academic, what Natsal does is try to normalise the experiences of a Joe public.
It seems from that young people are having more sex than ever at a younger age, and I wonder if part of that is the education system, because like another thing that came out was just how Victorian and prudish and frankly, I think, disgraceful the British sex education system is. People are being told that there's no sex positivity, there's no sex is enjoyable, that sex can give disease, and sex can cause pregnancy. 2 terrible things, right? And they never talk about sex being fun in schools, apart from a very few open-minded schools. We went to one at York High School, it was an academy, a very forward-thinking head, and they were getting in freelance sex educators to talk to young people about the fact orgasms can be great.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with sex education is it's supposed to be sex and relationship education. And what the only part of it that is mandatory are the biological aspects. And the bit that is discretionary and is done very variably, if at all, is arguably the most important bit about relationships. And sex is about relationships, and relationships are about trust. and none of which is discussed, and not none, but there isn't a statutory provision.
And as we referred to earlier, the hottest sex is with somebody that you know, and you build. It gets better and better and better, and that's what the survey shows.
Yeah, and if you want lots of sex, you need to, if you have lots of partners,
who wants sex as much as you
can have lots of partners and not much sex, and you can have one partner and lots of sex.
But I don't know if it's the natural state of a man to be more promiscuous.
But what does that
mean?
What does that mean?
What you mean? I know. Does promiscuity mean having lots of sex or having lots of different partners? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah,
I don't know. Well, but let's say it's lots of different partners.
What came out in the brain studies that have been going on since the sort of 60s is, and they were started on rats, and the rat studies, a lot of people call love rats. The phrase I think came from that. And these rats were literally fucking themselves to death if they were introduced with a fresh partner, but they wouldn't have sex again with the same partner. And there is a controversial theory that men are actually just rats. If you introduce a fresh sexual partner, they will get an erection and have an orgasm, because biologically we want 10 children with 10 partners. That's our work done. Let's lie back. And biologically, the women are there to nurture and bring the child up. Very, very unpopular, controversial, but it's out there. And it's still used as a defence for men being slags.
Yeah. It is. Which is the same as, if you're presented with a buffet, you're just going to keep eating until you fall over. Until
you explode.
And surely we aspire to more than that.
I mean, actually,
Where's the buffet?
The notion that men are driven by, testosterone, traditionally, the male sex hormone, the evidence in terms of testosterone is not, as clear-cut as one would perhaps be led to believe. There's certainly a level below which sexual function is impaired, but it seems above that threshold, there's not a linear relationship between increasing testosterone and increasing sexual behaviour. So it's not, we are not solely biological. We're social creatures.
I totally agree, and I hasten to add, I just think that theory that we're all rats or cavemen is bullshit.
Yeah.
And I think, if we are anything, we are human. And if we're human, we have the ability to know something that is right and wrong.
Yeah, and also I agree, we're more driven by social conditioning, I think, than our testosterone or anything like that. I really do think that. And, people go on about, there are enough humans now. We don't need to procreate like that to ensure the dominance of our species. We're dominant. It's okay. And I think we know that. And I don't think that's what drives us.
I just think this genetic kind of program theory reduces men to nothing more than like sex zombies.
Yeah.
And surely we're able to make decisions.
But I think you only need to look at the massive social change in that in the graph. There's a major demographic change, most marked in men, between between first sex and first child.
But yet we're still seeing lots of young men with sex addiction issues. So I wonder if anyone would like to fire some questions at us. Yeah. Hand goes straight. Do we have microphones? Can we get them? Or just shout.
And I also want to just chuck in before the first person gets to the mic, as a maker of art who believes that life imitates art, how are we going to address re-influencing young men to appreciate that which we're talking about?
Well, I think the only way of doing that is to start with a sex education program which begins with parents in the home. Yeah. And certainly to use pornography, no matter how unpleasant that is, as a cue. A negative force can be turned, I think, into a positive, by sort of telling our children, telling our sons, fathers, telling their sons that porn sex isn't real sex and you shouldn't expect porn sex of women. Because porn sex is very often unpleasant for women, and we don't do that if we're a real man. That's what I think. Yes, sir.
I have two points to raise. First, about the pornography. Yeah. You can almost say pornography is almost like this debate about violence in films. Is there too much violence in films? Is that having an influence in society? I would say that, could you argue that pornography is providing a service in terms of most men have those fantasies. I have those fantasies, but I'm in a loving relationship with my girlfriend. and I'm not going to act on some of those fantasies because I know as a man it wouldn't be pleasant for her. But still, I would like to have that fantasy in my head, and I like to watch it.
Yeah, I mean,
so, and that doesn't make me less of a boyfriend.
Yeah.
The second thing is the promiscuity thing. And I think, so I'm going to take 2 examples. There's this Mad Men is a very popular show, and the main character on that show is Don Draper.
Yeah.
So let's take this Don Draper character. He's idolized by both men and women. Men want to be him, and women want to be with him. There was another show a few years ago, Nip Tuck, where there was this character, Christian Troy. He slept with a bunch of women. He was the hero. And, you know, society, it's very confusing. In a way, you're telling us that stay in a committed relationship, but society is telling us something different.
No, I don't think, well, in answer to your first point, I think you're right and quite correct to assume that the overriding majority of people who consume porn aren't going to be, tainted by it. They're not going to be addicted to it. Of course, it's not a given. And by the way, I'm not an anti-pornographer. I think I'm a pro-choice, but I'm also pro-information. And I think you need to be aware that if you are going to start looking at porn, you could end up looking at porn which can be disturbing. And not only that, but we found during the making of the show that young men are using porn, that they're sending links to girls, 13, 14-year-old girls. They're saying, do you fancy a bit of this? And it's like, sex that's horrible for these girls, and it's scaring them. So I think while not everybody is going to become, some drooling porn zombie who goes out and rapes, like you might read in some newspapers that might say that, we need to be aware that it's an issue. As for the Mad Men thing, I think, bad guys have all, where are the pin-ups of stay-at-home dads? Yeah. Bad guys will always be glorified and celebrated in the media. That's was ever thus. It doesn't mean we should behave like them. And it was set in the 1960s and 50s. Hopefully men have changed since then.
But it's interesting that Beyonce and Jay-Z are doing this whole thing at the moment. Beyonce's latest album is, you could read apparently, and I agree, that it's all about having hot sex in their relationship. I think that's brilliant. And lots of people are doing blogs about, oh, it's really embarrassing, it's what are they doing, and it's not relevant, and whatever. That's a really good thing for one of the most powerful women in the world to do, is to say, I have really hot sex with my husband, and this is the dirty talk we have, and whatever. That's really inspiring. That's popular culture really dealing with this. Good for Beyonce.
Yes.
Yes.
For me, the central issue is around relationship, exactly as you say. It's completely flawed in the sex education process that misses the relationship bit. And it's very interesting when people are beginning to talk about we're understanding more and more and more about the brain chemicals.
Yes.
I mean, one of the chemicals we should talk more and more about is oxytocin. Yes. And oxytocin is a chemical that gets released, sometimes dubbed the tend and befriend. Yep. But it's the territory that comes when you're in relationship intimately. And I suppose I'm interested to know from your research and so on, my wondering is whether the behaviour of lots of men, particularly young men at the serious end of it, this is a defence against the fact that they were absent of intimate relationships. They didn't know how to make intimate relationships. So there's a link back to other workshops here about no fathers and so on. Yeah, so they don't know how to do it. Yeah. So I think there's the optimist in me, the green shoot in me, says that's the work. Particularly that we need to do with young men, about the good stuff, about making relationships and the chemical benefit that might come from it, let alone everything else.
Okay, well, absolutely, the brain chemistry thing is fascinating and intrinsically linked to becoming, hooked on any experience. And reward chemicals are very carefully understood now. And what we see, though, is a short-term release and chasing a constant high. That's the same as gambling or doing a line of Charlie or getting pissed. You want more, and porn does the same. And what you're talking about, a lack of strong relationships in their real life, I spoke to Paula Hall, who's the UK's #1 sex addiction therapist. She was saying 10 years ago, almost everybody who presented with a sex addiction issue had some form of traumatic event in their earlier lives. Maybe they may have been raped, it may be a sexual assault, or something more mundane and as important as lack of a father figure or an abusive father, things like that. Now, 90% are purely through stimulus, exposure to porn. So we have seen a big change. So while one is really important, where you get them both, then they're really in trouble. So they kind of quite complicatedly overlap each other, in actual fact.
And I think that from the research, you've done much more than me, but one of the really positive things is that brains are plastic, as we said, and so learnt behaviour can be relearned. So it's not pessimistic.
The teenage brain is an amazing thing, and teenagers get a lot of bad press, but it also has an amazing ability to unlearn bad behaviour through correct mentoring and coaching, and through the right help. And I think we should give teenagers more credit than they get.
Can we have T-shirts saying oxytocin, not dopamine?
Yeah.
I can't.
That's really catchy.
There's a guy up there who's just had his.
That'll really catch on.
There's a guy at the back who's had his hand up for a while. Yeah, he's in the middle at the back.
Hello.
Yes, it's you. Sorry, I just wanted to tell the roving mic people that he might want to be next. That's all. No, after you, sir.
We can hear you.
When you get the mic, mate.
Okay. Hi. So I'm going to maybe talk a bit about broad brushstrokes in terms of like British community and society, and my observations from my friends or peers who are, say, from Scandinavian and northwestern countries, northwestern European countries. I think so at the age of sort of 19, 20, I'm a few years on now, when I would talk to them about sex, they would talk about it quite openly in this sort of quite healthy manner. When I was sort of having sort of sex, but almost talking about it in quite a shameful, embarrassed way almost. And they would talk, it was very interesting how they would talk about it between their sort of male friends and female friends. And it's, as I've got a bit older, learned more about the society, it seems to be, they have less stereotypes around sort of female single mothers. There seems to be less ideas of patriarchy, and there really does seem to be more of a focus on community and more of a middle class base, less splits between like the rich and the poor. So how then can we in British society maybe move towards something like that? And that's a very open-ended question because it's quite social-cultural.
There's an awful lot in there. I mean, in terms of health inequalities, countries that have the narrowest gap between the poorest and the richest always fare better in all sorts of health outcomes. And the gap in the UK and the US are countries where we have really wide gaps, and we have shocking inequalities in health in all sorts of areas, not just sexual health. Lots of the Scandinavian countries have much more, the sex education, moves way beyond the biology into relationships. It starts much younger, it's more integrated. The societies tend to have more equal gender rights. There's less of these sort of unequal gender norms around the role of men and women, equal rights for parents, just much more equal societies. And across the world, if you look at violence against women, as a sort of extreme end, the societies that have the most different gender norms, roles for men and women, is where you see the most violence. So, they are deep cultural and social
the reason your Scandinavian friends were having those enlightened conversations, it starts absolutely in the schools. When we looked at the Dutch education system, they're being taught body awareness age 4. 4-year-olds are being told that's a penis, that's a vagina, and not a fufu or a willy, and they're actually being told what body parts are, what they do. We saw this amazing video of this project called Spring Fever, where 6-year-olds were very eloquently saying, my mother has sex with my daddy, she has a birth out of her vagina, and I have a baby brother. And you're like, fucking yes! Why can't we do that? Because they're having sex later in life. They're losing their virginity age 17 in Holland, 2 years later than here. And there are much less single mothers, 2/3 the incident, because they're cool with sex. So they're not ashamed of sex.
We still have this view that if we talk about it, somehow we're encouraging and condoning it, and it doesn't matter how much the evidence. And
that's absolutely not the case in real life.
It's the opposite.
Anywhere that has an open dialogue about sex and body awareness, very early in life, the results pay off. It takes 10 years. It's not a vote winner. Yeah. Definitely not if you're a Daily Mail reader.
Well, you know, and the things like the teenage pregnancy strategy, we have seen reductions in the UK in teenage pregnancies. But it's a 10-year strategy. You know, these things do take a bit of time. They don't happen overnight, and they don't normally happen within the life of a government.
There are things going on in Britain. We are trying to move forward. You know, there's the Respect Yourself Foundation. They're trying to do good work. They are desperate to get, and it is being trialled at present. There are, in private, in Britain, in Warwickshire, there are sex education programmes going on for 4- and 5-year-olds. And I pray it gets adopted nationally.
And don't you think there's a bigger issue as well, just culturally, which is about... We all have to manage having a body. You know, it's one of the great richnesses of being a human beings, where all our pleasure comes from. It's where everything experiential comes from. And, you know, we've got so many hang-ups about it in terms of health and food and sex. You know, we don't talk about having bodies very much. And so it's almost like, let's just pull the focus back a little bit more. In that way.
Well, so maybe some of this is the sort of fabled so-called hangover from Victorian values, you know, because, I mean, I remember having a conversation, quite unsolicited, about a really detailed conversation about cunnilingus at a dinner table in America with a woman that was so straight, she wore gloves when she was driving, right? And yet she was quite happy to talk about Todd, my friend's awesome oral technique, and that was one of the reasons that she decided to take him as a partner. No embarrassment, over dinner, and I tell you, that conversation in most middle-class households in Britain would have mortified most of the people around the table.
Yeah.
Now, so my point is this. I would assume that most people in this room would like to think of themselves as people who are not particularly chained by the bondage of the legacy of Victorian values, okay? Now, let's assume that we are. Some of the, you know, the lucky enlightened ones. Well, we have to pass it on. We have to prove it. We've had this discussion. So we're lacking then, I would suggest, if we allow ourselves to not have those open, difficult, potentially embarrassing conversations, to not do all the things that we've just been talking about, instead of chin-strokingly, you know, observe the situation and then go back to wanking over 2 Japanese women vomiting over each other.
Follow that. Did we have that question at the back? Anybody else like to fire away? Oh, there's loads. But the guy at the back that's been...
It sort of follows on from that last comment, really.
What about the vomit?
Almost. Although I don't fancy wanking over 2 Japanese women vomiting. But one of the things that I completely concur with the idea of this education, you get the education, sex in the context of relationships. But one of the most disturbing things that sort of came out was the fact that the pornographers are actually building in addiction to the programs.
Yeah, that's right.
And I'm also a therapist. I do addictions therapy. And I'm just wondering, you know, how do we respond? This is simply unbridled capitalism.
Yes, it is.
And how do we respond? How do we actually say, well, it's illegal, we will prosecute you if you build in these addictive programs?
Well, I mean, it's not illegal, that's the problem. But I sat down with a guy called David Levy. David Levy is Gail Dines' husband. Gail Dines, you may know, is like the world's foremost anti-pornographer. He showed me how these algorithms work in real time, and it was absolutely just incredible. The software really does know what you're looking at, and it knows what to give you next. It knows what should be next on your buffet. And when you see that for real, it made me angry. It made me angry that porn users are being manipulated when I think they think they're in control. There is an absolute subtext of manipulation. You can't stop it. You can talk about internet controls and blocking that. David Cameron's tried. Certain newspapers have an ongoing campaign against it. And you can't stop it. Kids just see technology as something to overcome. It's a challenge, it's a ruse, and they'll share that information. So that won't work. You have to tell them, I think. It has to be the parents. The parents have to say to kids, you know, when you look at porn, you think you're in control, you're not. And you need to make decisions based on informed conversations, rather than puritanical tellings off. It's interesting, we were talking about those who exhibited addiction at the clinics I went to, at least, came out of 2 households, 2 very different households. Total control, prohibition. We saw some Muslim kids. We saw some, really strict Christian households. Catholic flagellation, not the websites. Make a note of that. The households where they were told it was wrong, it was dirty, it was Victorian. They were secretly and shamefully consuming porn, and it became, a big problem. We then saw total and unbridled free access to porn. Here's a laptop, fuck off. That sort of thing. Just go to your bedroom, have your own laptop. 12, 13-year-old kids on this journey where no one's telling them anything is wrong. And because the websites aren't illegal, and because they're free, and because, hey, everyone's doing it, it's become the norm. So the only way of stopping that is to tell our sons that porn sex can be wrong, and they shouldn't be expecting it of girls who are scared.
And to make art that shows that too. And, I go back to our soap operas. You can't exactly discuss the ins and outs of porn at like 6:30 in the evening on EastEnders probably, but what mainstream, influential, returning television series and films need to start reflecting this as well. People we need to start seeing stories about what we're talking about, so that people can see it happen. And then have that Machiavellian, I better not do that, or then that'll happen to me.
And it's like we can't be reactive to things. We need to sort of build culturally a sense of a choice that not that the big bad capitalists will always be out to get us, but it's like we are always being sold something, and very, very cleverly. So we can't wait until there's this new thing, because who knows what's going to be here in 5 years' time. We have to, let's say, it's always your choice. Just observe the effect it's having on you. When you open a new screen, whether it's something you want to buy or whether it's something sexual, observe what happens inside you. Just take a moment and go, how is this making me feel? Do I really want that? Or am I just going, I want it, and then just clicking and not thinking? It's building in mindfulness as a cultural practice.
Yeah, great. And I think I'm being told we have to wrap up there, so I'm so sorry if you couldn't get your questions in. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you very much for your time. Thanks, panel. Yeah.